The auctioneer's gavel hadn't clanged once when the shout echoed through the crowd. Lady Trevelyan's body slumped onto the velvet-covered display podium, one gloved hand still clutching a white envelope. Her neck twisted at an unnatural angle, and blood trickled in a soft, steady drip onto lot 42. An antique compass, rumored to have belonged to a dowager duchess, lost at sea. The crowd gasped when the gavel finally fell to the floor, knocked from the auctioneer's hand by the second shout. Miss Marple, sitting in the second row, had already risen to her feet. Her gaze didn't fall on the victim, but scanned the sea of hats, pearls, and shocked faces. She noticed two things at once. The scent of perfume, acrid, bitter, and entirely inappropriate for that open-air shop, and the cold stare of a man in the background who wasn't looking at the body, but at her. "Back off! Someone get the doctor!" shouted the auctioneer, but it was too late in the afternoon. Lady Trevelyan was dead. Miss Marple walked quickly through the stunned customers. "Don't touch the envelope," she warned as she saw an officer's hand get too close. The murderer could have sealed it with something toxic. Before they could heed the warning, a second figure staggered from behind the dividing canvas, a young woman in a green silk dress, her mouth slightly foaming, her eyes wide with terror. "She was in the tea," she gasped. "It was for her." She collapsed in a heap next to the red rope barrier, her teacup falling and shattering into porcelain dust. Miss Marple was at his side before the officers turned around. "Back!" she snapped. "She's still breathing. Someone called Dr. Cartwright. She's been poisoned, the same smell as the one near Lady Trevelyan." The tent, once bustling with the buzz of high society and refined excitement, had become a battlefield. The auctioneers panicked. The lot catalogue was scattered across the lawn. In the distance, a church bell tolled, slow and somber. "Two women," Inspector Darnley murmured, arriving breathlessly, his eyes already on the bodies. "Both high society, both here for the same lot. 42, and now both are—" "Not yet," Miss Marple corrected. "The second girl, Miss Ava Glasspool, isn't dead, not yet, but if we don't act quickly, she will be." The inspector looked shocked. "Do you think they attacked them, together?" Miss Marple's gaze kept scanning the crowd. "I think someone's sending a message, and that message may not be finished yet." The wind ruffled the flaps of the tent, revealing the auction's other prize, a portrait of a sea captain clutching what appeared to be the same compass. Behind the canvas curtain, a faint electrical hum could be heard, generators powering the lights, now perhaps humming louder than they should. Miss Marple pushed the inspector aside. The smell, bitter almonds, cyanide in the tea almost certainly. And that envelope, Lady Trevelyan was holding it in her gloved hand, but I noticed the edges were damp. It may have been contaminated with a contact toxin. 2 different methods, Inspector. "Crazy," Darnley muttered, scribbling. "And you think the killer is still here?" "I'm sure of it," Miss Marple replied. "He or she didn't run away. They watched. One of them even looked at me while it happened." He subtly pointed to the back row. The man with the intense gaze had disappeared. Miss Marple's voice lowered. "We need a lockdown. Everyone under this tent must be accounted for. No one goes in or out. That man in the grey hat with the blue scarf was watching me. I knew he'd noticed." At that moment, a piercing scream echoed from the auction office tent. Another woman, a clerk, was found collapsed over an accounting ledger, her skin reddened and her breathing labored. 3 attacks in less than 10 minutes, the inspector whispered. "This isn't a murder, it's a campaign." "No," said Miss Marple. "It's a riddle, and every piece, every death, is part of the solution." An officer rushed over. "Ma'am, the envelope, it's gone. Someone took it in the panic." Miss Marple clenched her jaw. So the killer's already taken part in what he came for. The inspector grabbed the radio on his belt. "All exits must be sealed. I want officers stationed at every perimeter fence. No one leaves. That includes staff." The word staff struck Miss Marple with sudden clarity. Tea was served just before the auction began. Who had access to the refreshment trays? Only the waiters and the kitchen. "No," Miss Marple interrupted. "The tent was prepared in advance. Someone could have arranged it long before then." The inspector narrowed his eyes. "Then we've had a ticking time bomb on the premises all morning." In the crowd, a woman sobbed into a lace handkerchief. "I told her not to come. I told Lady Trevelyan the compass was cursed." "Cursed?" Miss Marple asked. "Explain that to me." The woman, pale and trembling, replied, "She received a warning letter saying that the widow's compass brought death to anyone who kept it under false pretenses. It said that the Duchess's spirit still lingered." The inspector sneered, but Miss Marple's interest intensified. Superstition, or a smokescreen for murder? The crowd was now completely enclosed in the tent, with uniformed officers lined up along the tarps like sentinels before a royal tomb. The atmosphere had shifted from a fashion event to a hostage situation. Darnley came over. "What do we do now?" Miss Marple looked down at the broken china teacup, then at the blood-stained velvet cloth, and finally at the portrait of the ship's captain, whose painted eyes stared eerily watchful. "We'll find out who sent the warning," he said gravely. "And then we'll find out who benefits if Lady Trevelyan and Miss Glasspool are eliminated from the bidding." The inspector nodded. "Do you think it's the compass?" "I think it's about what the compass says," Miss Marple replied. "And someone in this shop would kill again to keep that secret buried." "You'll have to decide quickly, Inspector," said Miss Marple, her eyes fixed on the hatch leading out of the auction tent as the officers took up positions. "The murderer is intensifying his attack, and with every minute of delay, another piece of this puzzle disappears." Inspector Darnley, still pale beneath his cap, looked at the doctors struggling to revive Miss Glasspool. 3 victims in less than 10 minutes. Poison, contact toxin, and now some kind of inhalant. This doesn't look like the work of one madman. "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "It's too composed. It's an orchestration." The auction site had been transformed. The rows of gilded chairs now resembled pews before a mournful vigil. Lady Trevelyan's body had been respectfully draped, but her envelope, the key to her bid on the widow's compass, was missing. The third victim, the auction official, lay motionless on a stretcher being wheeled toward a waiting ambulance, a transparent oxygen mask strapped to her face. Miss Marple turned to the inspector. "A pattern is emerging. Lady Trevelyan was a collector. Miss Glasspool, a known rival. The auctioneer, she must have known who the highest bidders were even before the event began. This isn't a random wave, it's surgical. Someone is eliminating those linked to the compass's destiny." Darnley frowned. "Are you suggesting that the 3 of them were targeted? To reduce the room for maneuver?" "Exactly. Think of this as a game of chess. These murders aren't final moves, but opening moves. Each victim is a piece removed from the board." An officer approached with a clipboard. "Ma'am, Inspector, confirmed names of all pre-registrations for Lot 42. He handed her a sheet of paper with 6 names clearly printed on it. 3 of them had a cross next to them. Darnley looked at the newspaper. 3 left. Miss Marple delicately took the list. Her finger tapped each name one by one. Lord Quentin Beckwith, Evelyn Marchmont, and, Mr. Lionel Hargraves. All locals, all well-known collectors of maritime oddities, and all, I suspect, standing somewhere in this shop, feigning great fear." She looked up, and her eyes met Evelyn Marchmont's. The woman was tall, stern-faced, and dressed in black as if it were a weapon. She met Miss Marple's gaze with a flash of defiance. "I suppose I'm next," she said tersely, approaching uninvited. "Why would you assume that?" the inspector asked cautiously. "Because someone decided this damn compass was worth killing for," Marchmont snapped. "And I was destined to outbid Trevelyan and Hargraves. No wonder they're dropping like flies. Miss Marple was unfazed by the woman's tone. And what makes the compass so valuable to you, Miss Marchmont? Evelyn frowned. Because it's not just a relic. It's a map. Inspector Darnley raised an eyebrow. A map? By a legacy, Marchmont said grimly. The widow's compass was said to contain directions etched into its brass casing, a coded alignment pointing to where the Duchess hid her late husband's last treasure. Trevelyan believed it to be romantic nonsense. I knew it wasn't, and Hargrave, she would have paid anything to keep it from me. And Miss Glasspool? Asked Miss Marple. He was a pawn, Marchmont dismissed. A gallery owner is looking to resell him for 10 times his value. He barely understood what he was playing. So you admit that the compass is worth killing for? Said Miss Marple in a low voice. Marchmont's gaze darkened. Yes, but not for me. At that moment, a commotion erupted near the rear. A man had collapsed to the ground, coughing violently, as if struck by an invisible force. The crowd surged forward again, forcing their way toward the canvas walls, but the officers held them back. "It's Hargraves!" someone shouted. "He's drowning!" Miss Marple was already moving, pushing her way through the tightly packed groups of chairs, bags, and frightened whispers. She knelt beside Hargraves as he gasped, his face flushed, clutching his tie. His attaché case had fallen open beside him, revealing a pile of old nautical charts and handwritten notes. "Poison," Miss Marple murmured. "Fast-acting. How do you administer it?" She examined his lips, his hands, the half-eaten cookie that was in his coat pocket, still wrapped. "Tea," Darnley murmured upon arrival. "Again?" "Number look. There." Miss Marple pointed to a small puncture on the man's neck, just behind his ear. "A dart?" Darnley exclaimed. "Or a fine-tipped syringe?" said Miss Marple. "Something subtle. He was hit just before he fell. The killer is still working in the room." "He's not dead," a doctor confirmed. "But almost. We're rushing him to the hospital." Miss Marple straightened, her voice hard. "There's one left. Lord Beckwith." The inspector examined the room. "Where is it?" They found him in the parking lot, halfway to his car. 2 officers arrested him under protest. "I have nothing to do with this," Beckwith shouted. "I'd leave before I ended up in a body bag." "On the contrary," said Miss Marple coldly, "you may be the only living thing we have left." Beckwith paled. "Do you think I did it?" "I think you were really keen to win this auction," he said. "So much so that you registered under 2 aliases and forged a 3rd letter of credit in the name of H. Sutherland." Darnley looked at her in surprise. "How?" "The auction records Miss Glasspool was reading before she fainted," Miss Marple said. "They were misspelt. The numbers were all the same. Beckwith tried to submit multiple bids under different identities to artificially inflate the price." Beckwith blushed. "That's not murder." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but the point is to ensure that the other bidders don't live long enough to discover your deception." "I didn't poison anyone," he shouted. "No," Miss Marple repeated, "but someone did. And now we know it's not a question of who wins the compass, but of who lives to open it." Darnley grabbed Beckwith by the elbow. "Come back inside." The crowd had quieted, more fearful than curious. Miss Marple looked again at the remaining names. Only Evelyn Marchmont remained untouched. For now, she told herself. The inspector approached. 4 victims. 1 attempt, all pointing to the same group. Miss Marple's voice lowered. "And we have a murderer who doesn't panic, doesn't rush, and doesn't hesitate. We're not arresting a murderer. We're chasing one who's already several steps ahead." He turned to the nearest agent. "Secure the compass. No more hands on it. No more staring. It's no longer an artifact. It's a decoy." "Bait?" Darnley asked. "For what comes next," he whispered. The faint chime of a carriage clock rang out from the estate's drawing room, a sound so precise and courteous that it seemed entirely inadequate for the chaos raging beyond the drawing room doors. Miss Marple stood beside Inspector Darnley at the long dining-room table, her gaze fixed not on the battered compass, now locked in an evidence box, but on the empty chair where Evelyn Marchmont had sat moments before. "He slipped away," Miss Marple murmured. "On purpose." Darnley rubbed his temple. "We had 2 officers guarding the perimeter." "2 constables," he said sharply, "watching a woman who's been a professional antiquities hunter in Mesopotamia, Lisbon, and New York. Do you think doors could stop her? This woman spent her life acquiring secrets." "We need to call for help," he murmured as he picked up the phone. Miss Marple's gaze fell on the compass. Its brass rim gleamed with residue from the forensic kit. She leaned closer and examined a scratch on its surface. It wasn't a deep cut, but a deliberate one. "Initials. RM, the compass," he said suddenly. "It's already been tampered with. Do you think Marchmont did it?" "No," he said, touching the box. "This mark was made years ago, but it tells us what Marchmont believes, that the compass isn't the prize. It's the key to something else. She was willing to kill to find where it leads. So was Hargraves. And now, only one person stands in her way." Darnley blinked. "Who?" Miss Marple looked up. "Me." The window behind them shattered. The glass exploded inward, covering the table with shards. A blunt object, old brass paperweight, the far wall, a few inches from where Miss Marple had been standing. A second later, the lights flickered and went out. Darnley lunged at the table. "Get down on the floor." But Miss Marple had already moved. Her mind was racing. The attack wasn't accidental. It was a warning. "Check the hallway," he whispered. "I'll go to the service corridor." Darnley hesitated only a moment before drawing his revolver and slipping through the door. Miss Marple moved quickly down the narrow side corridor, her footsteps silent on the worn, wooden floor. Every step she took increased the silence behind her. The house, once bustling Marchmont estate, now an auction house, had gone from echoing with polite bidding to a hive of danger. She turned a corner and stopped. A figure loomed at the end of the hallway, tall, motionless, breathing heavily. "You're clever, Miss Marple," said the gruff voice. "Too clever for your own good." She didn't flinch. "And you're afraid. Otherwise, you wouldn't hide in the shadows." The figure stepped forward, just enough for her to see the glint of something metallic in his hand. It wasn't a gun. It was a scalpel, thin, long, designed to cut silently and cleanly. "I told Evelyn this would happen," the voice continued. "I told her you couldn't be reasoned with." Miss Marple gasped. Evelyn had an accomplice. "RM," he whispered. The figure stopped. "You carved your initials into the compass," he said, "because it wasn't a treasure map. It was your map, a tool to preserve your right, your secret. Only now, the game is no longer in your hands." The raised knife. "And soon, so will your life." Miss Marple did not wait. He grabbed the nearest thing he could, antique globe from a hall table, and threw it. The balloon hit the figure in the chest, causing it to stagger. She ducked and ran, her heart pounding toward the kitchen. Behind her, the dull sound of footsteps followed, steady and swift. "Officer," he shouted, "get in the hallway, now." But no voice answered, only the heavy footsteps of his pursuer and the echo of his own labored breathing. She reached the laundry room door and stepped through it just as the figure lunged at her. A flash of metal cut the sleeve of her coat. She turned and slammed the door shut, wedging a broom into the handle as a makeshift barricade. She staggered back. Her shoulder was bleeding, but not much. Silence. So, loss. 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 The blade of the knife, smoothly making its way through the gap in the door, taunted her. Then footsteps retreated. She slumped against the wall, gasping. 10 seconds later, Darnley burst in with 2 officers. "We have a report. Someone saw Marchmont sneaking into the garden maze." Miss Marple stood up, pale but composed. "Then we'll split up. You take your men. I'll show her out." "No way," Darnley barked. "You just got attacked." "And they'll attack me again if we hesitate." She pushed past him, which means we're close to the truth. Outside, the estate's garden stretched out in neat rows, now sinister in the fading afternoon light. The labyrinth, once a charming feature at spring galas, loomed large. 3-meter-high hedges, winding paths, no visibility, the perfect place to kill. Miss Marple moved cautiously. Her instincts screamed at her to go back, to wait for the guards, but she'd seen too many people die waiting. He passed a statue on a forked road, a bronze sailor with a broken sextant, another nautical clue. He turned left. Voices were heard, Darnley's, faint in the distance. Then, silence. A click behind her. She turned slowly. Marchmont. Gun raised, eyes bulging. Her dress was stained with mud and blood. Her hand was shaking, but she aimed steadily. "You should have stayed in your cottage, Miss Marple." "You should have left the compass alone," Miss Marple replied calmly. Marchmont frowned. "It was never about the compass. It's about where it leads. My grandfather died searching for the widow's treasure. He left clues everywhere. This auction was supposed to be the final piece." "You've killed 3, Miss Marple said quietly. "And you've tried to kill 4. That doesn't sound like a legacy. It sounds like desperation." Marchmont's hand trembled. "I didn't kill them," he whispered. "Not all of them. I just wanted to scare Trevelyan. The others, it wasn't me." Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. "And then who?" A whisper from the other end of the maze. "Another figure." "No, Darnley. The accomplice." Miss Marple dove sideways as the second figure raised the knife, this time pointing it at Marchmont. A scream pierced the hedges. Then a shot. Then silence. Miss Marple jumped up, gasping, and saw Marchmont slumped against the hedge, the gun falling from his limp hand. And behind her, face down, the second figure, still holding the knife. "Miss Marple!" shouted Darnley, appearing behind the statue. "I'm here," he said in a trembling voice. "What happened?" Miss Marple stared at the fallen couple, blood spreading across the gravel. "Marchmont fired too late, but he hit his killer." Darnley blinked. "Her killer?" "I wasn't lying," Miss Marple said faintly. "There's another player, one who took advantage of Marchmont's obsession, and we don't know who yet." Darnley stared at the bodies. "So who's left?" Miss Marple's voice hardened. "Only one person knew the full value of the compass and the auction list before all this began." Darnley's eyes widened. "The auctioneer," they said in unison. The night air had become sharp and cutting, as if the town itself had taken a breath and refused to let it go. Miss Marple, wrapped in her torn shawl and blood-stained coat, was unfazed as Inspector Darnley's car sped along the winding roads. Her gaze was fixed ahead, scanning the darkened windows of the village houses, the flickering gas lamps that cast long, quivering shadows on the gravel roads. Beside him, Darnley cursed under his breath. "Do you really think the auctioneer is behind this?" "I believe," Miss Marple replied calmly, "that Mr. Alastair Moffat had access and motive. He knew what items were coming in. He knew how to manipulate deals. He knew who valued what and why." Darnley stared at her. "Do you think he set the compass? So, not planted," he corrected. "Preserved, hidden in plain sight for years, until the time was right to sell it." Darnley swerved the wheel, nearly clipping a hedge. "You're saying he orchestrated the auction not to make money, but to attract someone?" "Exactly," he said. "And Marchmont, obsessed as she was, wasn't the only one attracted." Darnley clenched his jaw. If Moffat wanted her dead, why wait until now? Miss Marple turned to him. "Because she was never the target." The officer in the passenger seat looked back. So, who is it? Miss Marple pursed her lips. Eleanor Street, James. The car skidded to a stop in front of the ivy-covered mansion known locally as Greystone House. Eleanor, the town historian and registrar of estates, had been in charge of verifying the provenance of every item in the auction. She herself had been in charge of the widow's compass, and now she was next. Miss Marple did not wait for the engine to stop. He got out of the car and was up the stairs in a matter of seconds, his pulse louder than the knocking on the door. "Eleanor," he shouted, "it's Miss Marple." "Open up." There is no answer. He tried again, more urgently this time. "Eleanor, he's coming for you. Let me in." A slight scraping noise can be heard from inside. Then silence. Darnley joined her. "Stand back," he said, drawing his revolver. One kick and the door gave way, crashing inward with a resounding creak. They burst into the dark hall. A vase lay shattered at the foot of the stairs. The hallway smelled faintly of musty books and something else acrid. Burnt oil? Miss Marple moved first. "Kitchen!" she shouted. "And check the library. She'd never hide in the cellar. There are too many rats." Darnley turned aside as Miss Marple crossed into the drawing room, his gaze scanning the chaos. Overturned chairs, a spilt inkstand, an open and empty drawer. Then a sob. She turned sharply. "Eleanor!" The sob was heard again, softer and more muffled. He walked over to the coat closet, grabbed the handle and slowly opened the door. Eleanor Street James staggered out, disheveled and shaking, clutching a sharp letter opener with white knuckles. "Oh, thank goodness," Miss Marple sighed, helping her up. "You're safe." "No," Eleanor gasped. "No, I don't think so." Darnley reappeared at the door. "No sign of Moffat. We checked the perimeter. He's not in the garden either." Miss Marple turned to Eleanor. "Did you come here?" Eleanor nodded, pale. "He said he needed to check the inheritance papers one last time. Then he asked about the compass. He seemed so calm, too calm." "What did you tell him?" "That he had found an inscription under the velvet of his box, coordinates engraved in Latin numerals." Miss Marple and Darnley exchanged a look. "I wanted them," Eleanor whispered. "When I refused, he grabbed me. I broke free. I locked myself in here. Then I heard breaking glass. I thought he was coming back, so I hid again." Darnley ran a hand through his hair. "We have to find him now." "No," Miss Marple said slowly. "We have to think like him." He crossed the room and opened Eleanor's purse. Inside, he found a folded envelope labeled Lot 143, the Widow's Compass. She unfolded the scroll inside. Coordinates, a date, and a name faintly scrawled in red ink, Widdershins Gate. "That's the key," Miss Marple murmured. Darnley frowned. "Widdershins Gate, that old farm near the cliffs." "It used to be a smuggler's checkpoint," he said. "More importantly, it was owned by the widow's son, Reginald Marchmont, the same man who disappeared without a trace after World War I." Eleanor nodded. "And according to my estate records, the door was sealed in 1922. No one has entered since." Miss Marple handed the paper to Darnley. "So that's where Moffat's going. That's where the compass points." Darnley's face hardened. So did we. The road to Widdershins Gate was barely a path, nothing more than a gravel ribbon winding between windswept hedges. The old barn slowly appeared, rising like a ruin from the mist. Its beams were warped with age. The gate of twisted iron and corroded hinges was ajar. Miss Marple trembled as she got out of the car. Darnley signaled to the guards. "Circle around, secure the rear." They moved silently with their weapons drawn. Miss Marple and Darnley crept towards the entrance. "Why would he come now?" Darnley whispered. "He's killed 3 people. What more does he need?" Miss Marple's voice was low. "Because the final piece is here. He placed the compass in the auction to lure Evelyn. He caused the deaths to hide his true purpose." Now, with everyone else gone, he claims the prize alone. They reached the threshold. Inside, the barn was dark. Dust swirled in the moonlight that filtered through the broken slats of the roof. Tools lay rusted along the walls, and in the center, illuminated by the glint of a storm lantern, stood Moffat. He didn't flinch as he entered. In fact, he seemed strangely calm, one hand resting on a brass chest half buried in the dirt floor. "You're too late," he said softly. "Stay back," Darnley ordered. Moffat didn't move. "She killed for this," he said, pointing at the chest. "Marchmont, Hargraves, even Trevelyan in his own way. I just let the chaos obscure the trail." "You murdered them," said Miss Marple. Moffat turned to her, his eyes hollow. "Number I revealed them. I revealed what greed does when it's shaped." Darnley stepped forward. "Last warning, Moffat. I knew someone would solve it," he continued. "And I knew it would be you, Miss Marple. Because you understand obsession, you've seen it before." He took a step forward. "And I've seen what happens when it's not controlled." With a quick movement, Moffat pulled something from behind the chest. A small jar. Darnley shot. The jar broke in midair. A chemical stench filled the barn as the liquid spread across the stones. Sizzling. "Acid," Miss Marple whispered. Moffat fell to his knees and coughed violently. Darnley rushed in and was handcuffed as officers flooded the room. Miss Marple stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the bronze chest. "I knew there wasn't treasure inside, not in the traditional sense, but secrets, letters, documents, a record of names and transactions that the widow had kept, blackmail material that lasted decades, enough to ruin reputations, families, and maybe even governments. It had never been about gold. It was always a question of leverage, and Moffat had almost killed an entire village to control it." Darnley joined the man, his face grim. "He'll talk." "He will," Miss Marple said quietly. "But I suspect he's already said all the important stuff." She turned to the chest. And slowly, for the first time since the auction began, the people exhaled. Miss Marple stood in the flickering gaslight outside Greystone Manor, staring into space as the officers escorted Alistair Moffat to the back of the police vehicle. The town should have breathed a little easier now, with the supposed mastermind in custody. But Jane Marple knew better. Something still pricked at her periphery, like a loose thread crying out to be pulled. Eleanor Street James, wrapped in a thick wool blanket and holding a teacup with trembling fingers, sat on the stone bench near the front steps. Her eyes did not meet Miss Marple's. "I still can't believe he was behind all this," she whispered. Miss Marple crouched down beside him. "It wasn't." Eleanor snapped her head toward her. "But you said—" "I said he orchestrated the chaos." "He did. But chaos," he added gently, "is not the same as purpose." Eleanor's hands tightened around the cup. Miss Marple stood up and turned to Inspector Darnley, who had reappeared beside the patrol car with a frown and his arms crossed. "He doesn't talk," he murmured. "Nothing useful, at least. He rants about balance and exposure, about bringing the truth to light, but he won't admit to the murders." "That's because he didn't kill them," said Miss Marple. Darnley clenched his jaw. "He was there, Miss Marple, at the auction, at Greystone. He ran away when we tried to question him. He attacked Eleanor." "He manipulated the situation to his advantage," she agreed. "But the deaths, those were precise. Personal." He raised a gloved hand. "And most importantly, each victim died differently. Trevelyan with a stun gun, Hargraves by electrocution. Marchmont was injured by blunt force trauma from the compass itself. No trace, no consistency. That's not a message. It's revenge." Darnley stared at her for a long moment. Then he cursed under his breath. "So, you're saying there's still someone else out there?" "I think there always was," he replied. and I think they're just getting started. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with a sky that seemed streaked with soot. The mist drifted like smoke between the trees. Miss Marple sat in the vicar's study next to Reverend Philby, a ledger open between them. Eleanor had found it buried among the auction papers, the original record of donations for the Royal auction. Miss Marple's finger ran along the columns. "Here," he said. "Lot 38, donated by Hilda Barrington." Philby blinked. "That's a 17th century hunting horn, isn't it?" Miss Marple nodded. "Sold to Trevelyan for £220, and Lot 47, the mechanical snuff box, is also yours." Philby seemed puzzled. She was a well-known collector. Her estate was liquidated after her death last year. Miss Marple pursed her lips. However, he left no will, no family, and no mention of these items in the probate inventory. She turned the page. All of these items, marked as anonymously donated, were part of Barrington's estate. Philby straightened slowly. "Do you think someone falsified the donation list?" "I think someone took advantage of the auction to redistribute the contents of a private collection and took advantage of the confusion to settle personal scores." A knock interrupted them. Era Darnley. He looked grim. "You have to come with me. It's happened again." The body lay in the village square, sprawled across the steps of the now-walled auction house. The crowd had already gathered, villagers huddled together, wearing scarves and hats. The police had cordoned off the area. Miss Marple pushed her way through the officers. The victim was young, perhaps 25. Her blonde hair was stained with mud and blood. Her throat was bruised, but it was the stiffness and unnatural posture of her limbs that betrayed the truth. She had been posed. Eleanor gasped behind her. "That's Beatrice, B. Martin. She catalogued the auction items with me." Miss Marple examined the body. In B's right hand was a folded piece of brown paper. Darnley carefully extracted it, a word handwritten in rough ink. "Truth." Miss Marple closed her eyes. It wasn't over yet. The real killer had been watching, waiting, and now that Moffat was in custody, they'd struck again. The pattern was no longer about hiding the theft. It was about silencing those who knew too much. They met again at the station. Miss Marple was pacing back and forth while Darnley served her the tea she hadn't drunk. "They found her outside the auction house," he said. "No one saw anyone enter or leave. But you know what? We found traces of wax and old parchment fibers under her fingernails." "He had a fight with someone," Miss Marple murmured, "and he touched something old." Eleanor nodded. "She was working late last night in the museum annex. She said she was checking some inscriptions." Miss Marple turned. "Where?" "The Barrington boxes," Eleanor whispered. "The ones that arrived without being on the list." Darnley grabbed his coat. "We have to find them now." The museum annex was cold and quiet. In the center of the room, a series of ornate wooden trunks, sealed with shipping seals, were stacked neatly near the display wall. Darnley opened one. Inside, silver candlesticks, brass compasses, maps sealed in oilcloth. Miss Marple picked up a faded Book of Property Records and stopped. The inside cover bore the name Reginald Marchmont, 1917. He looked at Eleanor. "You said there were no records of him after the war?" "None," Eleanor said. "He's presumed dead." Miss Marple flipped through the pages and stopped at an entry marked in red ink. "Transfer to H.B.'s estate in exchange for silence." She looked up sharply. "Barrington blackmailed Marchmont," he said, "and Reginald paid with stolen goods. That's why his mother kept the compass. It wasn't a souvenir. It was insurance. And now someone wants that past to remain buried," Darnley said. They heard the crash a second later. A glass breaks, and then a scream. They ran into the hallway. A figure dressed in black burst through the back door, his cape billowing. Miss Marple didn't hesitate. She followed him. through the hallway, out the back door to the patio. She glimpsed the figure heading toward the side alley near Mrs. Green's bakery. Too fast. Darnley shouted from behind, but the figure was already gone, vanished into the mist like a ghost. Only one thing remained, a folded piece of parchment nailed to the wooden door. Miss Marple knocked him down. Scribbled in the same irregular handwriting, "The widow's debts are still unpaid. One remains." She exhaled. There is one goal left. The killer was counting down, and the next victim was already chosen. The vicarage bell rang at noon, but in the streets of St. Hedwig's it felt more like dusk. The shops had closed early. The school children were called home. The doors were locked from the inside. The curtains rustled sharply, and anxious eyes peered out from behind the lace. Miss Marple stood on the corner of Dove Lane, watching the fear rise like a storm tide. She had seen many kinds of danger over her years, but rarely had she seen a town descend into such deathly silence. He turned to Inspector Darnley, who was standing beside him. If the killer's goal was to paralyze the city, he succeeded, he said quietly. Darnley rubbed his eyes, the dark circles under them after 2 sleepless nights. People are scared. They think Bee's death means the auction curse is real. It's not superstition, Miss Marple snapped. It's methodical. The killer is taking advantage of the chaos of the auction to eliminate people connected with the Barrington collection, to whom he might reveal the truth. He nodded gravely. The marshals have tripled their patrols. We've imposed a nighttime curfew. No one enters or leaves the village without authorization. He turned around. That will only force them to hide even further. Do you have a better idea, Miss Marple? Yes, she said. We have to smoke them. 3 hours later, the town square was cordoned off with thick ropes and gas lamps, flanked by uniformed police. The residents had been summoned, by loudspeaker, by bell, and, in some cases, out of fear. Miss Marple stood on the makeshift platform, erected on the museum steps. Darnley addressed the crowd first, reading from a hastily typed sheet, "Citizens of St. Hedwig's. We face a grave threat. Currently, all objects related to the Barrington estate are under forensic review. Any private property recently acquired through the royal auction must be voluntarily surrendered to the museum annex for examination. Failure to do so will result in immediate seizure." The murmurs increased. Panic spread. Hands gripped coat lapels more tightly. Miss Marple came onto the stage. "I know many of you are afraid," he said. "I am too." She let the words settle. "But this isn't a curse. It's not a ghost. It's a person. A very calculating person. And they've counted on your fear to silence you." His voice became higher. 4 people have died. Another is hospitalized. A 5th was almost killed last night. These are not accidents. They are related. Not by chance, but by knowledge. He looked at the faces. "The killer is among us. Maybe he's right next to you." This silenced even the children. "You must report any receipts from the Barrington collection outside of the official catalogue. Anonymous delivery? Private sale? Clandestine exchanges? You name it." For a long moment, no one moved. Then a hand rose near the rear. Mrs. Peltwick, the postmistress. Her voice trembled. "A week ago, a small package arrived at the sorting plant. It wasn't returned. A wax seal with a bee on it. Inside was a clasp and a note. Just one line. 'Once belonged to you.' I assumed it was a joke." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "What did you do with it?" "I put it in the desk drawer." "I can go get it." "No," said Miss Marple. "Stay here. We'll be able to pick you up without any problem." Then another hand. Then 2. By dusk, a dozen objects had appeared: a compass, a dagger, a diary, a child's ring, all anonymous deliveries, all sealed with wax. The killer hadn't just acted in the shadows. He had littered the village with a tainted history, hoping people would stumble upon truths they didn't understand. And one of them had to die. That evening, Miss Marple was back in the museum annex. The dimly lit room was buzzing with forensic activity. Eleanor was organizing the labeled items, wearing gloves and squinting at the faded inscriptions. Darnley stepped in with his arms full of new evidence bags. Miss Marple turned to a specific item, a fine velvet case, once part of Lot 21, never bid on and never claimed. She opened it. Inside was a miniature astrolabe. Exquisite craftsmanship, clearly ancient, but it wasn't the object itself that took her breath away. It was the card that was hidden behind. A handwritten invoice. Initials RM to HB, Reginald Marchmont, a Hilda Barrington. Another secret sale, another missing thread. Miss Marple turned to Darnley. We need to double-check Marchmont's service history. Where he was stationed, who else was with him. We already did it. Not the files. It's the letters. He frowned. What letters? He confronted Eleanor. Didn't Marchmont's widow donate her war correspondence to the Historical Society 2 years ago? Eleanor blinked. They were never processed. They're still in storage. Then we need them. Tonight. By midnight, Miss Marple had spread the letters out on the long display table. Faded ink, army postmarks, descriptions of bunkers and rations. And then, here, an envelope marked August 12th, 1919. She read aloud, "The compass is cursed, Reg. Give it back. You stole it from that cave, and now Peter's dead and I'm still dreaming of water. I sent mine to that old woman in Dover. She said she'd keep it hidden. You should do the same." H. Darnley read over his shoulder. H. Hilda, Miss Marple whispered. She knew. The collection was originally looted. Darnley paled. Spoils of war. And ever since then, someone has been trying to cover their tracks. A knock on the side door of the museum made them all freeze. Miss Marple asked for silence. The knock was heard again, faster, louder. Then a voice, "Miss Marple, it's George from the bakery." Darnley opened the door. George staggered in, out of breath. "It's Mrs. Aldbridge," he gasped. "She's collapsed in the square, blood pouring from her chest, and she's not moving." Darnley grabbed his coat, but Miss Marple's mind was already racing. "Mrs. Aldbridge, I had bought the pair of ivory hairpins, supposedly from the Barrington collection." Miss Marple ran off into the night. They arrived at the scene in 3 minutes. Mrs. Aldbridge lay collapsed on the cobblestones, her eyes open and her lips moving weakly. Blood was pooling under her blouse, but there was no wound. Miss Marple leaned towards us. She wasn't stabbed. It's gunpowder. Something red. A dye. Darnley turned it carefully. Pinned to the back of his coat was a piece of parchment. 3 words. She brought out Mal. Miss Marple stood with her spine rigid. Now the killer sent messages, mocking them, challenging them. The victims were not only being selected from among those who had handled the artifacts, but were also being used as living warnings. The killer wasn't just erasing the past, they were rewriting it. And if Miss Marple didn't find the final piece soon, she would be next. By dawn, the story had spread like wildfire. Mrs. Aldbridge's collapse was now the 7th incident, and although she had survived, her cryptic message, "You choose wrong," had taken on an almost mythic quality. The local press published an emergency edition titled "The Barrington Curse Spreads," with a blurry photo of her being wheeled into the clinic. It was precisely the chaos the killer needed, and Miss Marple knew she could no longer operate in plain sight. She needed to disappear. "You're not leaving without an escort," Darnley whispered, scanning the now fortified museum annex. "This morning alone, we've received 2 threats. Someone scrawled a message on the bakery window. Next is the old girl. By the way, it's you." Miss Marple finished buttoning her coat with the quiet determination of someone unaccustomed to danger. "That's precisely why I need to move around without being seen." Darnley threw up his hands. "If you want to go underground, fine. But if you disappear without warning, it'll send the town into a panic. Give me something, anything I can tell the constables." Miss Marple leaned closer. "Tell them I've fallen ill and retired to the cabin. Let them read the story, then post an agent at my door, visible. Let the killer think I've left. And where will you really be?" He tapped his temple. "Where I always go when the truth is hidden, to the past." Eleanor found her at the back fence of the vicarage garden, wrapped in a borrowed shawl and carrying a bundle of files hidden in a wicker basket. "You'll be safe here," he whispered, leading Miss Marple down the narrow, overgrown path behind the rectory. "The vault beneath the chapel hasn't been used for 50 years. No one even remembers it exists." They reached the door behind the altar, a solid oak door with a rusty lock and just enough dust to deter curious onlookers. Eleanor opened it with a creak of hinges, revealing the staircase descending into cool, dry shade. Miss Marple entered without hesitation. By flashlight, he spread the file out on a moss-stained wooden table that had once held communion cups. Decades-old military letters, auction records, curators' memos, personal correspondence from the Barrington estate. The image was enlightening. The collection was cursed. Yes, but not by the myth. Because of guilt. The Barrington artifacts weren't acquired, but stolen, loot traded and trafficked with a false provenance. During World War I, soldiers discovered a hidden chapel in Belgium, buried under rubble. Among the relics it contained an ivory compass, an astrolabe, a dagger, and a brooch. The compass had been the most prized item and was rumored to have belonged to a condemned cartographer who encoded dangerous secrets in his markings. The theft was led by 3 men, Reginald Marchmont, Hugh Barrington, and an anonymous official. The objects were divided up, hidden, and years later laundered through the royal auction system with false documentation. And now, someone was clearing the path. Eliminate anyone who may have received these items, especially those who were aware of the theft. But who? Miss Marple opened Marchmont's last known letter, never mailed, found among the unsorted heritage. "We bury the truth under medals and silence, but guilt festers in the darkness. If Hilda ever finds out I kept the compass..." Miss Marple froze. It was not Hilda Barrington who discovered the secret. It was someone who inherited it, someone linked not to the crime, but to its consequences. A child, a spouse, a beneficiary, a blow-up. 2 soft knocks, then 1. Eleanor's signal. Miss Marple climbed in carefully. "Urgent," Eleanor whispered. "There was a break-in at City Hall. Nothing was stolen, but someone left something." She handed him a folded note. He said, "You have 1 hour to return what he stole from you." On the back, sketch of the compass. Miss Marple's stomach sank. This is more than just retribution. They think the compass contains something. "A map?" Eleanor guessed. "No." Miss Marple looked again. "Not where to go. But who was there?" He ran back to the crypt, grabbed the compass, and unscrewed the bronze casing with trembling fingers. Inside the back panel, hidden in the hollow space, was a rolled-up piece of rubber. She unpacked it. It's not a map list. Names, ranks, and a final scribbled line. "Witnesses to the Barrington robbery. Signed affidavit. Use only if I'm not present. R. Marchmont, 8 names. 7 were dead. 1 remained alive. Professor Alton Radley." Miss Marple left the vault just after dark, wrapped in Eleanor's shawl and carrying the compass under her blouse. She quickened her pace as she reached the side entrance to the town archives, where she knew Professor Radley had been working under police surveillance. Except now there was no guard, there is no light inside. She slipped through the door and into the record room. "Professor Radley?" There is no answer. Then, a high-pitched sound from the next hallway, a book falling or muffled footsteps. She came closer, and he found it. He was lying on the reading bench, blood dripping from his temple, still breathing, just... She pressed 2 fingers to her throat. Pulse, weak. Then he saw it. Another piece of parchment. Last chance. Give back what's ours. His eyes shifted to the file shelf beside him. The box labeled Marchmont. Personal effects was open and empty. She turned around and froze. The shadow moved behind her. So, an accident. The flashlight broke. Darkness. A voice hissed from the darkness. The list doesn't belong to you. Miss Marple grabbed the compass in her coat pocket, and he said very calmly, Then why leave Radley alive? Unless you're afraid I'll name you. Silence. Then footsteps were heard moving away. Whoever it was, frustrated, perhaps insecure, wasn't ready to kill her. Not yet. But the final phase had begun. An hour later, as they walked back to the museum annex, Darnley looked at her as if she were crazy. You left a safe hiding place for what? Rummaging through relics and finding a list? Do you have any ideas? She lifted the raincoat. He blinked. Read it. And he sat down heavily. My God. Miss Marple nodded. It was never about the artifacts. It was about the names, the shame, the cover-up. Whoever's doing this wants to bury this list forever, and they're almost done. Darnley whispered. We have 1 name left. Miss Marple turned around and was already moving. Number, we only have 1 chance left. You're saying the killer is connected to that list, Darnley repeated, looking at the yellowed parchment Miss Marple had extracted from the compass box. So why eliminate the others? Because the list is a record of guilt, Miss Marple said, her tone tense and urgent. And someone believes that guilt, buried for decades, can still ruin reputations, ruin inheritances, or, worse still, reveal a lie that has become an obsession. Darnley rubbed his temples. But we've already lost 6 people connected to these objects. That leaves us. Just 1 name, Miss Marple said gravely. But it's not that simple. I think we're looking at the wrong source. These murders aren't committed by a victim. They're orchestrated by someone who inherited a motive. The original sin may have belonged to Marchmont and Barrington, but now the revenge is personal. She touched the last name on the list. Captain Alton Radley. He's alive, yes, he continued, but barely, which means the killer wasn't prepared for his testimony. That's a flaw in the plan, a weakness we can exploit. Darnley frowned. What now? Miss Marple stood up, her gaze fixed on the resolution. Now we're going to set a trap. The plan was set in motion that same evening. A seemingly innocent notice was distributed announcing a private meeting in the museum's greenhouse. The pretext, a ceremonial inspection of the latest item in the royal auction, supervised by the town council and the historical society. Miss Marple made sure that all the names still alive from the records in the wider collection were present. But the reel, the one he kept in his coat pocket, contained a different set of targets. Children, widows, beneficiaries. Those who might carry the pain too long, too silently. A legacy of shame, perhaps, or revenge. At 8 p.m., the wrought iron gates of the greenhouse creaked open. Tension hung in the air like pipe smoke. The guests arrived in cautious pairs, museum docents, historians, descendants of retired officers, and 1 or 2 auctioneers from nearby districts. Miss Marple was sitting in a corner, seemingly idle, drinking black tea. But his eyes never stopped moving. He watched Mr. Pelham, the former manager of the Barrington estate, tremble near the portraits. He watched Helena Chubb, curator of the 1982 Barrington exhibition, widowed and silent, her hands clenched near her handbag. He watched Clarissa Radley in particular, the professor's daughter, alone. No one noticed his return to the village. Until now. She stood at the edge of the greenhouse, her gaze fixed not on the meeting, but on the compass, the same one that Miss Marple had deliberately placed in the center of the display case. Clarissa didn't move for a few seconds. Then she came closer. "It's a beautiful piece," Clarissa said in a calm, distant voice. "More than beautiful," Miss Marple replied gently. "She keeps secrets. Some are older than the war." Clarissa's gaze shifted to her, or buried by her. Miss Marple smiled slightly. "Your father was a good man. Brave, they say. But he knew something, didn't he?" Clarissa tilted her head, examining the artifact. "Did he ever tell you what he saw in Belgium?" Miss Marple asked gently. Clarissa didn't respond. Instead, she leaned closer, lowering her voice. He was tormented, not by what he did, but by what he didn't stop. Miss Marple remained silent. "My mother died believing the compass was cursed," Clarissa continued. "She whispered about voices, shadows, but it wasn't madness. It was guilt, because she knew. She knew what had been taken." Miss Marple narrowed her eyes slightly. "Did you do it?" Clarissa smiled, a slow, sad smile. "I found the letters 2 years ago, in a locked box in his study. Descriptions of the theft. The chapel is in ruins. The priest begged them not to take anything, but they did. They mocked him, they laughed, and the compass passed from hand to hand, washed, catalogued, auctioned, displayed. And one by one," Miss Marple said quietly, "they began to erase them." Clarissa exhaled slowly. Number Y started correcting the file. "Do you think I wanted them to die?" Number I wanted confessions, acknowledgements, but when they denied it, when they pretended it never happened, then the guilt had to be eliminated. A chilling pause, even if it wasn't his from the beginning. Across the room, Darnley stirred as he noticed Miss Marple and Clarissa standing unusually close. He took a step forward, but Miss Marple barely raised a hand. "Stay back." His eyes never left Clarissa. "There's a problem," said Miss Marple. "Your father signed the affidavit. He confessed in writing. He was going to come forward." Clarissa's expression faltered, only slightly. "No," she whispered. No. He burned the letters. He said it would ruin everything." Miss Marple took the parchment from her coat pocket and unfolded it with delicate precision. His lyrics, his list, his truth. Clarissa's face paled. He knew it wouldn't be enough to erase the past. He decided to own it. Clarissa stepped back. The trembling in her hands was no longer under control. Her gaze shifted toward the greenhouse doors, now quietly closed. 2 officers were outside. She was trapped. You tricked me." "I gave you the chance to tell the truth about your father," Miss Marple replied, "but you used it to silence others, even those who had nothing to do with it." Clarissa's voice rose hysterically. "They showed off the compass, like it was a prize. No one asked where they got it. They didn't care." "Nobody ever does," Miss Marple said gently, "until someone makes them." She extended her hand. Clarissa's fingers moved inside her coat pocket, not for the compass, but for something heavier, bright, cold. Darnley shouted, "Gun!" But Miss Marple was quicker. She stepped forward and slammed the table, knocking the compass into Clarissa's path. Clarissa instinctively lunged to catch it and dropped the knife. It fell loudly to the ground. Seconds later, the officers handcuffed her. Clarissa screamed, not in pain, but in grief. "He begged me to hide the truth," she sobbed. "I did what he asked. I hid it in their hearts." Miss Marple turned away, her eyes moist with something that was not exactly sadness and not exactly relief. Later, in the cold light of the museum's upper gallery, Darnley sat next to Miss Marple as the officers took statements. "She would have killed you," he said. "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, "but not before she tried to explain herself. That's when I knew I could stop her." Darnley exhaled. "This is what guilt looks like after 30 years. Miss Marple folded the parchment. "No, dear. This is what happens when we let shame fester, when we deny what we did, or we don't forgive what was done to us. He leaned back. So it ends here. She shook her head slightly. Stories like this never end. They just get more and more hidden. I don't like it, Inspector Darnley muttered, staring at the cell door as if he expected it to disappear. Clarissa's locked, and yet I have a knot in my stomach. It's too quiet. Miss Marple didn't reply immediately. She stood near the police office window, staring out at the green village. The evening shadows stretched across the cobblestones like creeping fingers, and yet the silence offered her no comfort. That's because we stopped the wrong killer, he said quietly. Darnley turned sharply. What do you mean? He confessed. He confessed to orchestrating deaths, Miss Marple corrected, but not all of them. He admitted to 3, there were 6, and the method doesn't match up. Darnley opened his mouth to protest, but hesitated. The poisonings, he continued, were inconsistent. Clarissa lacks access to and knowledge of chemicals. The timing was erratic. The fire at the Marchmont stables. Too chaotic. It's deliberate. That incident was a fit of rage. A slow sigh passed between them. She didn't start this, Inspector. She continued it. At 9 p.m., Miss Marple was back at the Royal Museum, alone except for the security guard and 2 agents who were once again searching the auction room. Now she moved slowly, tired, yes, but also distracted. He mentally retraced his steps, jotting down names and deaths on a piece of paper. There were too many discrepancies in the chronology for a single killer. Clarissa's involvement centered on 3 victims, all directly linked to Barrington's war artifact files. And the others, a widow who served tea at the wake, assistant to a historian who never appeared in the original war book, and a man who died before the public announcement of the compass. Miss Marple sat and stared at her list. It was almost like... His eyes narrowed. It was a test. The first death was not to hide guilt. It was to test the answer. She grabbed the museum staff directory. There was one person who had been present at every key moment. Silent, efficient, almost invisible. Mrs. Elise Hadwell, retired auction registrar. He is currently acting as a temporary consultant for the review of the village's royal collection. Miss Marple arrived at Elise's cottage 20 minutes later, escorted by Darnley and a plainclothes officer. The lights were on, but the windows were closed. No response at the front. They turned back. That's when Darnley froze. "The kitchen window is open," he whispered. They passed carefully. The house was silent, strangely clean, until they reached the living room. And I saw the tea tray. 2 cups, one intact, the other half drunk, with a sprig of hemlock floating on the surface. And at his side, a handwritten letter to Miss Marple. Miss Marple picked it up slowly. Her name was written in tight, bold letters. She unfolded it. "Miss Marple, you are astute. You see patterns. But I always wondered if you would see the shape of this one before it closed completely around you." Clarissa was a child thrashing in grief. She couldn't see that guilt isn't what truly torments men. It's the fear of exposure. You were never meant to die, but you did need a distraction. As you sniffed in the shadows of war, the true heritage slipped away. The compass is not a relic, it's a map, to cherish and to avenge. I've already selected the final recipient. At dawn, another name will be erased, unless you figure it out in time. You always liked games, right? And Miss Marple stared at the signature for a long moment. "Elise," he murmured. "Damn it," Darnley whispered, scanning the rest of the room. She planned it. Miss Marple's mind whirred. "He's chosen his final victim," he said, folding the letter carefully. "This isn't just a final act. It's a statement." He tapped the note with his finger. The compass being a map isn't a metaphor. It was restructured, modified. I saw those engravings. They weren't military, they were topographical. "So, where is it pointing?" Not where, said Miss Marple. Who? Within an hour, the town was back under lockdown. Officers were dispatched to every person on Miss Marple's remaining suspect list. Roads were blocked, boats were searched, but Elise Hadwell had disappeared. So did the compass, and Miss Marple's instincts screamed. Think, she whispered to herself as she looked at the list. Think, Jane. 3 names. One was under surveillance. The second had fled the village. The third, Miss Marple's pen stopped. She grabbed her coat. At 11:30 p.m., Miss Marple was outside the rectory. The door opened slowly, revealing Reverend Paul Ashbury still in his robes, his hair damp with sweat. Miss Marple? He asked in surprise. What? I think you're about to be murdered, she said, walking past him into the living room. Ashbury blinked. What? She held up the letter. Elise Hadwell is carrying out a purge. All of her victims benefited from war, thefts, either directly or through inheritance. All of them except you. So why me? Because you did inherit something, just not an artifact, a truth. He stared at her. Your father was the chaplain at Barrington Hall, the only one who confronted the officers about their thefts, the only dissenting voice in that ill-fated archive, and the only one who survived. Ashbury sat down heavily. Yes, he made me promise never to touch him. He said he'd only bring blood. And he did. Miss Marple approached the bookshelf. But your father kept records. He had to. He found a leather-bound journal behind the Book of Common Prayer. She opened it. Names, prints, sketches, and the original compass pattern. It is not just a topographical design, but a burial map. Elise thinks you have the final key, Miss Marple said, which means you're next. The lights went out. They both froze. Then steps. Fast, sure, deliberate, on the gravel road outside. Miss Marple dragged Ashbury to the back of the room. Darnley burst in seconds later with the gun in his hand. She's here, he barked. Elise is on the ground. We have 2 men on the perimeter. The glass broke behind them. A black-gloved hand threw a dark object through the window, and a cloud of smoke erupted, hissing and thick. Miss Marple coughed, her eyes watering as Darnley rushed to cover Ashbury. She heard the front door creak, boots, fence, intimately. She grabbed the Reverend and shoved him behind the curtain as Darnley tackled the intruder, only to find himself staring into a decoy smoke flare. No, Miss Marple cried. He's already in. But it was too late. The soft click of the living room door closing from the inside sealed it. Elise stood quietly by the fireplace. A sword gleamed at his side. You didn't solve it in time, he said in a low voice. Miss Marple looked her in the eye. But I did bring witnesses. She took a step back. The bookcase moved, and 2 officers emerged from the hidden niche where Ashbury kept the parish records. Elise's calm was broken just a moment too late. She lunged, but Darnley tackled her mid-attack. The leaf fell to the ground with a crash. Elise screamed, not in pain, but in rage. You don't understand, she shrieked. They left his rotting body in the chapel basement. My brother. They laughed while they stole. Miss Marple knelt beside him as the handcuffs were put on. I understand, he said quietly. But murder is never atonement. It's just multiplication. Elise Hadwell sat handcuffed to the cast-iron radiator in the police station's holding room, her pale eyes shining with a strange serenity. She hadn't spoken since the failed attempt to break into Reverend Ashbury's house. Inspector Darnley paced behind the glass, his jaw clenched. Miss Marple, sitting by the desk with her notebook open, watched Elise with a mixture of sadness and calculation. It's not over yet, Miss Marple murmured. Darnley turned. What? The plan doesn't end with her capture, he said. Elise is methodical. Everything she's done has been riddled with distractions. Clarissa was a weapon, not an accomplice. The real target is still out there, and she has a contingency. He frowned. We've confiscated your property. We've recovered the compass. What else could you possibly control? Miss Marple tapped her quill thoughtfully. She told us so herself. The compass was a map to retribution. He closed his notebook and stood up. There's someone else, someone who isn't listed in the log. They returned to the museum at dawn. The morning light illuminated the Royal Auction House in a dull grey, bathing the war relics in a cold illumination. The compass had been secured behind glass, along with other Barrington artifacts. Miss Marple walked slowly through the corridors, her gaze passing over dusty portraits and broken medals. Then she saw him. A plaque below the main compass display, newly engraved, anonymously donated in memory of Captain Roland Hadwell. She whispered, "Oh dear." Darnley leaned in. "What?" Miss Marple pointed at the title. Roland Hadwell was not Elise's brother. But she said, they let his body rot. But that was another distraction. Roland Hadwell was an officer in Barrington, a perpetrator, not a victim. Elise's brother must have been one of the plundered, the silenced. She orchestrated this entire vendetta under the guise of sisterly revenge. She turned sharply. Which means someone others donated this. Someone with Roland's treasure. That compass was stolen twice. Darnley narrowed his eyes. Who the hell has the second key? Miss Marple didn't reply immediately. She walked toward the portrait gallery, looking at each face. And then it stopped. Mrs. Violette Weatherby, the late widow, had been a patron of the Royal Museum for decades, but her will, as Miss Marple now recalled, had been quietly contested after her death. "Get your lawyer," Miss Marple ordered. "Right now." 3 hours later, the lawyer, a pale, trembling man named Mr. Beechcroft, was sitting in the policeman's office, sweating through his shirt collar. Lady Weatherby made a secret donation, he confessed, under a pseudonym. The terms required anonymity, but I had to coordinate the transfer of several heirlooms after her death. She insisted it be done through the auction house's chief archivist. Miss Marple leaned forward. "Name?" Beechcroft hesitated. "Edward Grange." "Of course," Miss Marple whispered. "The quiet, lame man, always around, always forgotten." Darnley was furious. "We didn't even question him. He was present at every crime scene." "Because he controlled them," said Miss Marple. "Elise was the executor, but Edward Grange was the designer." Night fell again. A trap had been set. Miss Marple returned to the museum alone. The building was empty. Only the compass remained, prominently illuminated inside the central display case. She waited. The air excited shortly, before midnight. A soft scrape of a door latch. A cough muffled by a cloth. Footsteps. Miss Marple turned around. Edward Grange emerged from the shadows. His limp was more pronounced, his hands trembling, but not from fear. In advance. "I was wondering when you'd stop chasing Elise and come looking for the hand behind the sword," he said quietly. Miss Marple said nothing. "She believed it was about justice," he continued, "but I always knew it was about clearing the record. History is a ledger, and the Barrington robberies were a stain that demanded erasure." He took a step towards the compass. "This map leads to more than just treasure. It leads to the truth. Names, ledgers, locations of the dead." Miss Marple's voice was cold. "You used pain like a scalpel." "I used it like a scalpel," he repeated. "Exactly." Then he raised the compass. "But it's a waste for the living." He threw him to the ground. The glass broke. Darnley and his men burst in a moment later, weapons drawn. Grange smiled as he was approached. "Too late," he whispered. "You always arrive. Fair too late." Miss Marple was standing next to him. "No," she said. "This time I arrived just when I wanted." He turned to the smashed box and pulled out from the rubble not a compass, but a decoy. The real one was moved this morning, he said calmly. With the list of war victims hidden inside, his book of silence will be published tomorrow. Granger's smile faded. The air inside the auction house buzzed with quiet anticipation. Miss Marple stood near the podium, her hands folded, her gaze fixed on the corked niche just behind where the prized sapphire compass had once been displayed. Every villager who hadn't fled the village was there now, drawn by a sudden and urgent invitation. An invitation drawn up by Miss Marple herself, hand-delivered under the pretext of a postponed final round of bidding. But what she had orchestrated wasn't an auction, it was a trap. Inspector Craddock paced in the shadows near the door, his revolver tucked into his belt. There were officers at every exit. No one would leave until the killer was unmasked. Miss Marple's voice echoed around the room, deceptively soft. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. You may have noticed that the sapphire compass is no longer with us. In fact, it has been taken from us by the murderer we are all here to catch." Gasps were heard. Reactions varied. Surprise, fear, indignation, but Miss Marple expected something more. The signal, the twitch, the only reaction of foreknowledge. Then she saw him. Mrs. Dunstable. Her gloved hand froze, half raised, staring off into the back corner. 1 second too many. A breath held too tightly. Miss Marple filed it away. Not guilt, but fear. 3 deaths, said Miss Marple, approaching slowly. Mrs. Halberd, Mr. Withersby, young Evelyn Clark, 3 victims, 1 pattern. From her bag, she took out Evelyn's broken mirror fragment, clean and the small torn piece of paper she had found in the fitting room. She held them up. They all possessed fragments of a will, one that granted ownership not only of the sapphire compass, but also of a long-forgotten deed to the Marshwood estate. The killer intended to consolidate both documents and conceal the will's existence by eliminating anyone who had a fragment. Sir Andrew Carrington, red-faced, interrupted. "What are you implying? That this entire event, this auction, was a front for property theft?" Miss Marple turned to him. "You know it was, because you organized it." The silence was absolute. Sir Andrew stammered, I resent the insinuation." "You inherited Marshwood," Miss Marple said coldly, "but your brother, Cecil, contested your claim." "That contest disappeared, and so did he, and the original deed was thought to have been lost in the war." Carrington stepped back. "Pure conjecture." "But Evelyn Clark," Miss Marple continued, "was her niece. And she recently discovered a letter which proved that her father, her late brother, did intend to give her Marshwood. He never told her, of course. He told her mother, who then told Mr. Withersby." Sir Andrew's face turned grey. "And Mrs. Halberd?" Inspector Craddock asked, intervening. Miss Marple nodded. "She was the bridge. She managed Clark House for decades. Evelyn trusted her, but when the letter resurfaced and the compass was found to be part of the deed's hiding place, someone decided it was safer to eliminate witnesses than to negotiate." From the bedroom, a soft tinkling. Craddock pulled out his pistol. "Wait," Miss Marple whispered. "Let him finish." Sir Andrew stood motionless, trembling. "You can't prove any of this." Miss Marple turned around again. "Can't I?" He reached under the podium and pulled out a leather-bound ledger. "This was found in the attic of the Marshwood estate, your father's last inventory record. It describes the compass, the deed, the division of the inheritance, which you amended after the fire." Another voice, harsh and bitter, spoke from the bedroom. "She's right." Everyone turned around. Edgar Bellamy appeared. Once discarded like a fragile relic, Edgar's face twisted in fury. "I was there the night Cecil died. I was the butler. I saw Andrew forge the documents and burn the originals. But I held on to the one thing he wasn't expecting. The mirror fragment from Evelyn's room, the last thing he inherited. Carrington pounced. Craddock fired once into the air. "Enough!" barked the inspector. The officers crowded around. Sir Andrew fell to his knees, sobbing, his rage turning into pathetic wailing. Miss Marple let out a sigh. "It's over." But Edgar stepped forward. "Not entirely. You need to know. He didn't act alone." Gasps again. All eyes turned. Miss Marple's voice sounded almost tired. "Let me guess. Mrs. Dunstable?" The widow stood up, pale. "They forced me. She threatened my nephew. She said she would report the theft from the War Widows Fund. Something I did, out of desperation." Miss Marple nodded. "He exploited your guilt. But you didn't kill. You helped cover it up." Craddock made no move to arrest her. "Let it be recorded," said Miss Marple, "that grief and guilt are powerful weapons used by a man desperate to hold on to stolen wealth." As the bailiffs led Carrington away and the last murmurs died away, Miss Marple felt the tremor of resolve settle in her breast. The deed would be returned, the murders had stopped. But evil, once awakened, always leaves a scar. The silence after the shot was more disturbing than the scream that had preceded it. Miss Marple stood her ground, one hand pressed lightly against her chest. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at Edgar Bellamy, who was now kneeling beside Sir Andrew's fallen body, the pistol still clutched in his right hand. "Stay where you are, Mr. Bellamy," he said calmly, though his voice was shaking from the exertion of everything before. "You've taken your last step and your last mistake." Bellamy looked at her, not with defiance, but with a strange resignation, like someone who'd been rehearsing the ending of his story for a long time. "I never wanted to kill anyone," he said, cautiously placing the gun on the ground. "But that man destroyed everything. He robbed the auction, buried the will, and humiliated my sister. I didn't know how to make him pay." Inspector Craddock burst into the hall, revolver drawn, with 2 officers behind him. "Don't move," he shouted. Miss Marple simply nodded. "That's it, Inspector. She's not resisting." Craddock strode across the room and kicked the gun away, out of Bellamy's reach. Sir Andrew groaned. The bullet had struck him in the shoulder. It wasn't fatal. It was fitting, perhaps, that the man survived to face justice and public exposure. As paramedics and reinforcements arrived at the mansion, Miss Marple gave a detailed statement. She stood beside Inspector Craddock as the others were led into the drawing room, now a makeshift waiting room. The air vibrated with the tension of scandal, guilt, and whispered betrayals. "I had my doubts at first," Miss Marple said as Craddock guided her through the final sequence. "But as soon as I saw the compass, oriented exactly southeast, and compared it with the auction inventory, I realized someone had orchestrated the whole thing. Items were deliberately mislabeled. One piece had even been hidden. The Duchess's medallion was never hers. It had no provenance." "And Bellamy?" Craddock asked. The locket was his key. It belonged to his sister, who died in disgrace after Sir Andrew's machinations left her penniless and marginalized. The compass was his gift. She called it her North Star. He used it as a symbol, as a warning. That's why it appeared in every scene facing southeast, the direction of his burial ground. Craddock frowned. "But the poisonings, the chandelier, the clock tower explosion—" "It wasn't just her doing," Miss Marple said gravely. "She was planning to sabotage the auction, but someone else took things further. Sir Andrew suspected Bellamy of meddling and retaliated to silence him. He poisoned the tea Miss Crawford drank, not realizing the cups had been switched. Lady Braithwaite was never meant to die." Craddock whistled softly. A revenge within a revenge. "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "Bellamy sabotaged the locket auction, planted the fake inventory, and set the trap in the bell tower to frighten Sir Andrew. But he never deliberately killed anyone, until the very end." In the drawing room, Sir Andrew, already bandaged, was seething beneath his tailored coat. She fooled them all, he snarled. She's not a spinster detective, she's a manipulator. Miss Marple approached with the quiet dignity of someone who has danced on the edge of death and returned with the truth. You knew about the will, she said, and you knew it disinherited you. You buried it with your conscience. You turned this royal auction into a final insult to everyone you trampled underfoot. You can't prove it, Sir Andrew muttered. But Mr. Bellamy did, she said gently. His sister's letters, her diaries, and the actual will which he took from his secret safe and left in the auctioneer's office, sealed, dated, and witnessed. The inspector nodded. A lawyer has already authenticated it. Sir Andrew's boasting deflated like a balloon. He looked away. Bellamy, meanwhile, sat silently, his hands cuffed but his posture relaxed. He looked at Miss Marple without hatred or gratitude, only with a weary recognition. You could have left, he told her. But pain, if left unresolved, can become poison. I wasn't trying to kill, he repeated. Just expose. But it doesn't matter now, she replied. 2 people are dead. No truth is worth that price. Later that evening, as the mansion emptied and police tape was stretched over the iron gates, Miss Marple sat once more in the quiet of the library. The rain had started again, tapping gently on the windows as if reminding her that the storm had passed. Craddock joined her with 2 cups of tea, both carefully removed from a secure tin. You were brilliant, he said. Simply persistent, she replied. Evil doesn't always scream, it often whispers. We must listen very carefully, he smiled. Well, if I ever sell my belongings, I'll make sure you're first on the guest list. She laughed softly. And outside, the weather vane's compass finally changed direction. For the first time all day, it was pointing north.